Welcome back, everybody, to our Sustainability Lounge. It's Dr. Sam here, the lead for the IMPACT10X Sustainability United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and also the JCU Innovation Facilitator. And as always, in our Sustainability Lounge, we speak to our thought leaders, our mentors, and our advisors and have what we call a critical conversation where we can deep dive into very specific elements around sustainability. And today we have another amazing guest. It's Donna Patane. And Donna is one of our legal counsels here at the JCU Founders and Residents portfolio. And you will actually see Donna in action every Tuesday of every month, working very diligently with all of our founders. Donna has also assisted us greatly with her expertise in our Impact 10X Cohort 20 this year already. And she's also going to continue on her journey with us in our Impact 10X Sustainability. And today we're going to actually position a critical conversation around ESG. And we've already had a conversation around environment, social, and governance. But today we're going to focus more around legalities around the perspective and also the criteria. So, Donna, it's great to have you here. And thank you so much again for all the great work you do. And I know that this is going to be another great conversation with you. And perhaps we can start the conversation around your perspectives on ESG and the legalities that we should be considering, especially as we launch into our Impact 10X series. Over to you, Donna. Thank you.
Hello, and thanks for having me in this fabulous outlook. So ESG is something that is an acronym that has been thrown around quite a lot. And I think people have a general understanding of the types of things that it covers off, but perhaps not more knowledgeable about the nuances and what that actually means and how do we show that our startup or our company is meeting criteria in relation to environmental, social, and governance expectations. And a lot of it is about sort of positioning and making your startup look more attractive to consumers and to investors and whatnot. From a legal perspective, it's still developing to a certain extent. So there is a small level of sort of compulsory disclosures and reporting that you have to do, but a large degree of it is really about making sure that you have policies and procedures and practices to make sure that you're trying to keep your startup compliant and doing a good job and having those good feel-good fuzzies. So you'll probably find there's quite a lot of chat under the environmental aspects of that ESG. So that's what is your startup doing in terms of environmental compliance and sustainability and waste and native title and some of those greenwashing aspects, which will be covered separately. So I thought we could chat a bit more about what sort of legalities and requirements there are under the social and governance aspects of ESG. So social is talking more about those relationships with your consumers and your stakeholders and your employees. Legally, under that sort of head of the ESG, we're looking at things like privacy and data security, modern slavery, which is relatively new legislation that technically only applies to companies with $100 million turnover, but that could be you in the future. But more sort of pressing, typically the companies at that level need to filter down their supply chains. And so you end up getting wrapped up if you're supplying to, coals or a, massive listed mine. So you've got to be conscious of having processes in place to make sure that you're not, so that when you are called upon to provide some sort of input for that, large organization reporting, that you can, with clean hands say, here's what we're doing to make sure that we are not inadvertently, creating practices or employment that amounts to modern slavery. So that's a big ticket item, mainly because of that trickle down issue and being wrapped up when you're in the supply chain. The other things are diversity, inclusion, bullying, harassment, anti-discrimination, things that come from, fair work legislation. And really the main points there are to make sure that you have policies in place So policies that cover off, and your data security as well, a policy for how you're holding data. Are you compliant with privacy legislation, particularly if you're dealing in health somehow? Have you got policies around discrimination and harassment that might be premature if you are a sole founder? But once you start having other people involved in your startup, in your company, certainly getting those policies happening quite early. So that's probably the main legal aspects from the social head of the ESG criteria. In terms of governance, this is a big one, and it traditionally has been quite a big one because we've had ASIC and APRA and ACCC looking at these things. We've had corporations law for a long time. Most of you will find that your startup at some point will roll into a corporation and we will be caught by that legislation. And it's really about, so in the eyes of the law, a company is a separate legal entity to an individual. So there's all of this legislation wrapped around. We know that that's a separate entity at law, but we want to sort of pin some things on people at some point. And we know that people are controlling what this company is doing. So there's a lot of regulation, which increases as your company size increases. So when you're sort of sole founder, sole director, there's more of a sort of alignment between what the company is doing and what you are doing personally, because you're creating the company, making it take certain steps. So you're sort of more at risk at that level. Then as things grow and you end up sort of into the listed space, you've got significant disclosure requirements. From an ESG perspective, the types of things that get wrapped up by that old corporations law is an obligation to disclose when you're pitching for investment, say, or when you're doing annual reporting to your shareholders, things that the shareholders ought to know that might have some sort of impact on the value of their holding or their decision to invest. So is there something within that that creates additional risks because of the way you're doing something? Or are you making sure that the decision making and the processes are clear and who is entitled to make what kind of decisions? And is there a accountability or sort of feedback loop for how decision making occurs? Again, sort of linking back to some of that greenwashing sort of thing in terms of making claims. So if you're making claims that can't be sort of reasonably justified through your research or your prototyping or your market research, and you're sort of applying a little bit too much creativity to some of the claims, that can be quite serious consequences under disclosure obligations in the corporations law, as well as the Australian consumer law, which has this really broad sort of protection measure for consumers against anything that is misleading or deceptive conduct. So if you're sort of consciously or ought to have known better, be careful of what kind of claims you're making so as to avoid liability over those heads. And some of those will have liability or consequences that will filter back to directors, see through that corporate veil. So there's a lot going on in that space. That's my quick sort of broad brush of the main issues to be aware of, because you're early stage, but it's something that certainly is growing in interest, both in terms of investors and consumers. You know, companies having this social license to be able to operate because of the way consumers feel about how they're doing things and keeping themselves above board from an ESG perspective. So something to be conscious of. A few things to add to your list as you grow, and then naturally, obviously, the boxes and the ticking and things like that increase as your success increases.
Excellent. And I think a real take-home message that I kept hearing you say, policies in place, policies in place. Like, you need to be thinking about this early, and as you're building and developing your startup or your SME. Yeah.
Had a discussion yesterday, in fact, with a group of founders, and one of them was talking about, he's only got sort of 3 employees, but one of them has been a little bit rogue on social media. I said, is there a social media policy? So fair work legislation and cases have taught us that you need to have policies in place, and you need to train typically annually on these policies so that your employees know, same with harassment and discrimination and all of those sort of policies. So your employees know what their expectations are, and that means that you are better placed if you need to let go of an employee because of their conduct, either with other employees or on social media. And that's getting more and more important as all of us are on social media.
Yes, absolutely. And with Web3, there's just so many other elements and considerations that we should be thinking about. So my question then to you, Donna, is as we look at the ESG criteria, are there resources or websites or other places that we should be thinking about going to in order to look, more into, the specific criteria that you've mentioned? What
So
sites would you recommend?
at the risk of being a little bit boring, I find the best source is the original source. So
Hmm.
ASIC for anything related to companies, and ASIC does put out standards and blog items and whatnot,
Hmm.
as does the ACCC, and you can see any recent action the ACCC has taken against companies for doing naughty things,
Hmm.
and fines and whatnot that they can issue. So an APRA for anyone who's providing financial type products or
Hmm.
services. So ASIC, APRA, ACCC.
Hmm.
Um, Fair Work Australia will have its own. So those are sort of the makers of the rules and those who do take enforcement type action and do reviews.
Hmm.
Um, who else? There's probably a couple of the sort of top tier law firms that do occasionally. I saw one of them recently did a webinar on some of the ESG aspects.
Oh, cool.
They've got hundreds of stuff, and so there'll be a junior lawyer somewhere who's reading and will provide a fairly good summary for you. So subscribe to some of those perhaps, or otherwise
Excellent.
just socials. I tend to get a lot of my updates from LinkedIn actually.
Yeah, yeah, me too. Um,
Mhm.
and I think what I'll do is I'll add this into our Slack channel so that there's actually a lot of because this is really great information and great resources for all of us actually. Uh, can I ask one other question? Because I think you brought up a really, really important factor, and I'm seeing this more and more as we go to, prep our startups, getting them ready and founders ready for investment and getting ready for pitch. So my question would be is from your opinion, obviously, if you've approached the ESG criteria and you've gone through, your company lens and perspective, this actually could be the like most investable aspect to your pitch, right? The fact that you've actually covered this. Can you give us a little bit more insight and what you're seeing and maybe some even ideas?
Yes, and yes, absolutely. As sort of broader consciousness becomes more aware of ESG, and there are dedicated impact investors who are really targeting these types of things as well. So there's consciousness on both sides, I think, of startups and companies making sure that they're keeping themselves above board and doing the best they can, but also investors actively looking for high
Mm,
ESG companies to invest in. In terms of what goes in your pitch, I think the main thing is to make sure that you know what you're talking about. So don't sort of throw out ESG. And I've heard some that have been like, "Yeah, we're a high ESG company," but when you prod a little bit further, there's not a whole lot of sort of knowledge or understanding or appreciation of what that actually means,
mm,
and what you need to do and how you need to do it in order to truly promote your startup as a high ESG. So it's about understanding and perhaps do yourself a little sort of cheat sheet where, environmental is your company's impact on the environment. What direct impact do you have? What sustainability practices are there? Can you show us? Is there some sort of realness to what's going on there? In terms of social, do you have those policies in place? Can you show you have that social license to operate because of the relationships you have with stakeholders and investors? Have you got good diversity inclusion practices in place? Are you doing what any of those policies say? There's a lot of slack at the moment around zero tolerance. We have zero tolerance for bullies. Okay, that's great, and maybe that's what your policy says. Can you show us? And if a situation occurs, what would that process look like? How do you? And zero tolerance is a little bit too sort of black and white for me. I would prefer, we've got a process or a policy that sets out how we identify, mitigate, and respond, making it a bit more sort of real. In terms of governance, being conscious of who is on your board, and what practical things are in place in terms of making sure that your board meets as required? What's the record keeping like? Do you have a process to check off what claims that you are making in terms of your product or your service so that things are justifiable? Are there any skeletons that you really should be disclosing? Make sure you disclose them, because it will hurt a lot more if the skeleton comes out later after you've taken money. So being conscious of what those ESG things mean, and really practically, how are you doing that? Give examples, detail. Take you a long way.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that's just such great advice. You mentioned high ESG impact companies. How has that been measured, and where can we find that?
Great question. Nowhere. Nowhere.
Exactly.
Presently, nowhere. So there was
Yeah.
some reviews happened recently, and there was some discussion about some of the listing rules. So even then, that's
Yeah.
listing rules. That's not startups. Talking about what could we put in to try and measure this. In my mind, and if I'm seeing a pitch, high ESG would be something that has high processes and consciousness and sort of those practical aspects across the E and the S and the G. Sometimes there'll be one that's very environmentally focused, and certainly that's probably everyone in this current cohort, because probably your value proposition is really well aligned with high environmental consciousness and impact and all of that. So you're probably already, just by the nature of your solution, quite high in the then it's a matter of just having a look at what does that social stuff mean? What does that governance stuff mean? What can we put in our pitch that covers off those things? And sort of the almost the more detailed, the higher. Maybe that's as close as we can get to measuring, but no formal process or map.
Yeah,
Unfortunately.
yeah. It's an interesting field, and I think there's more technology to come in that space for sure. Don't you
Yeah,
think? Yeah,
yeah,
exciting.
yeah. I think
Well,
some of the country has said Australia is a little bit slow on that stuff.
uh-huh.
So yes, there's opportunity there for sure.
Yeah, and we'll just put a plug in here for one of our founders in residence. So Linneon Labs is looking at that as a solution, actually going out and providing that type of metric and measurement, which is really exciting, and
Yeah.
linking that to productivity, how well that company actually performs in the stock market. And I think it's exciting to see that happening in our founders and residents portfolio here, which is brilliant. Okay, so we're coming up to just wrapping up, and you've given us some really amazing insights. So, really greatly appreciate it. But I'd just like you to now share, because you've been through Impact 10X with us before, just some general advice. What would you give anyone that's starting this journey with us on Impact 10X? What would you like to share with them and to our participants?
Oh, well, I mean, have fun, because you will. You and I had fun last time. And the caliber of the people and the teams that you're working with is really impressive. That's something that's consistent across cohorts, which is really great. Probably the main tip is and the process itself will really well guide you through the types of things you need to cover off and how to work out your market and whatnot. So I leave that in the hands of the process. Probably my biggest tip is around the pitching, because efficiency is key in terms of getting your pitch across, and you'll be given a time frame to do your pitch. So make sure you stick to it. And really hitting the points, bang, 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 and being snappy and quick is actually really valuable when you're holding the attention of investors or judges, whoever you may be pitching to. Typically, sort of only a handful of slides. Keep it high level, because the idea of a pitch is to grab attention and lead to another discussion. So grab the attention, hit those main points about the problem and the prototyping. And yes, it works. And here's that sort of engagement we've got having. This is amazing. And that will then lead into further discussions about details. So punchy, few slides, stick to your time limit. nail it.
Excellent, excellent advice. Thank you so much, Donna. And we'll be doing a more of an advanced session, as we've discussed, on intellectual property, trademarking, a lot more legalities that we need to be thinking about as we move through the Impact 10X methodology. And I know that you'll be also joining us for our demo day as well. So look forward to seeing you center stage next week. And thank you so much again, Donna, and really, really appreciate your time with us and your expertise. Thanks
No
again.
problem.
See you
Having me.
soon. Bye bye.
Bye.